Today, I want to give you a framework that's going to take your Hyrox running to the next level. Before we dive into the details of that, I want to get one thing very clear right off the start, and that is that Hyrox is a running sport with obstacles. To look at it as a mix, an equal mix of strength and running, I think is a mistake. It is a much more running biased sport. And when it comes to making progress in your Hyrox training, running is by far the biggest lever that you have to move. As a quick little thought experiment, let's say your goal is to subtract 30 seconds off your running time per kilometer each round. So you're taking 4 minutes total off your time versus, let's say, 30 seconds on the sled. To me, both of those are a pretty similar level of difficulty. Maybe you could argue, it'd be more similar if you said 30 seconds off both sled push and sled pull. So that saves you a minute total versus 4 minutes from the running. So you get a lot more return on your investment in training for running. And for some other stations, it's even worse. For example, think about trying to shed off 30 seconds off of your farmer carry time. It's just not going to happen, right? You can train as hard as you want, but the amount of effort you have to put into that for 30 seconds on one station versus a similar ROI on all your runs, you're getting much more value on the runs. With that being said, let's dive into how to build a running program for Hyrox. So as a very good starting point, you can start with an 80-20 split of easy and quality work. So when I say easy, I'm talking zone 2 or easier. And then your quality work, you probably want to be mostly in zone 4. There is some flexibility there, but zone 4, generally a pretty good spot to be. I will mention though, that split of 80-20 can be a little bit nuanced. This is something that a lot of very elite athletes push and use in their training, and it absolutely makes sense for them, obviously, because it's gotten them to the point where they are. But if you're looking at, for example, a Hyrox Elite 15 athlete or pro athlete in just about any other endurance sport, they're probably training 15 or more hours per week. For a lot of people that are just recreational athletes training for Hyrox, the odds that you're training for 15 plus hours a week are not very high. Most people have a real life outside of training. As a result, I would argue that the most important thing first is that you make sure you get your quality runs in every week. And then with whatever time you have left, add zone 2 around that. This is all as a rough guideline. You will have to experiment a little bit and find what works for you and what you can recover from. And again, that is a key factor, is if you're doing too much high-end quality work and you can't recover from it, and it's compromising your other workouts or even your next quality workout, it's not worth it and you need to dial it back slightly. With that being said, let's dive into what an 80-20 split could look like in a typical week and how you can modify it depending on the number of training hours that you have. So I like to divide it into 3 components. So one is, this is by far the biggest portion of your 80% of the week, is doing multiple zone 2 runs. The next component will be doing at least 1 quality run, maybe 2. But again, if you're doing 2, it's probably because you're training a lot of hours in a week and you have a very good capacity to recover. The final component that I would recommend is doing 1 long run a week. And again, that'll be zone 2, but quite a bit longer than what your base easy day zone 2 runs are. And just so we're all on the same page here of what zone 2 is, I generally define it as a conversational pace, meaning that you can have a conversation while you're at this training zone, but it's not necessarily that you want to. So if you're kind of at a point where you can have a conversation, but it's a little bit uncomfortable, that's probably a good sign you're in the right spot. So for your multiple zone 2 base runs every week, 30 to 60 minutes is a good place to be. And the exact distance that you get in that 30 to 60 minutes is going to depend on what your pace is and what your base background fitness level is. Personally, for me, I'll be doing around 2 zone 2 runs a week. Both are at about 10 kilometers long, and I'll run it just under an hour. Key thing with these runs, you don't want to be overdoing it and pushing into zone 3 and creating residual fatigue that's going to affect you as you move into your quality run. So, as far as a quality run, what that goes for, as I mentioned earlier, is you want to be mostly in zone 4. So, this should be a controlled discomfort is probably a good way to put it. So you're not going all out, but it should suck. You by the end of it, you shouldn't have a lot left in the tank. At the same time, though, you don't want to be dropping off at the end of the run. If you can't sustain the same pace throughout the entire run, you're pushing too hard. With that being said, there are also different ways to format this. So a couple of my personal favorites are to do an interval run or a tempo run. So for both of those, starting off with a 1 kilometer warm up, pretty good spot to be. You can adjust that depending on how you personally like to warm up for your runs. And then from there, for the interval run, currently what I'm doing is 8K worth of, excuse me, for the tempo run, I'm doing about 8K worth of tempo, but I've started that off probably doing 4 or 5K, and then I progress that over time, usually adding 500 meters or so a week. With the interval run, there's lots of flexibility here. Currently for me, this looks like the 1K warm up, and then 6 rounds of 1K followed by a 90-second slow, easy jog. You can also change around the interval length. So if I'm really looking to progress this, then I could do, from 1 week to another, I can go up to a 1.2 and then a 1.4 and a 1.6, a 1.8, and then a 2 kilometer. And then typically what I'll do, as long as things are progressing well, when I get to that 2 kilometer, if I'm still able to sustain the same pace during my intervals, I'll go back to the 1K intervals, but increase the pace. And again, this is very important that there's multiple ways to progress over time. So another thing you can do is you can change the rest period in between each interval. So for example, instead of 90 seconds, I could push it down to 60 seconds would be a great way to do it. Lots of different ways to format this. If you have a heart rate monitor on, a good way to check that you're in the right spot is just, as a rough estimate, go by the heart rate zones and ensure that at least later on in the workout, you're pushing well into zone 4. And again, it should be quite uncomfortable, but you should be able to sustain it for at least a little bit. One thing that I will add as another format for quality runs is there is the option to do VO2 max work. I typically wouldn't recommend this for Hyrox unless it's more of like an off-season sort of thing. But what this would look like, for example, you could do one way I like to do is 800-meter repeats. So that'll take me about 3 minutes. And then from there, I'll do about a 4 minute rest. And that typically when I do that rest is just um, a walk, not even a jog, just full recovery. Want to be back to as close to 100% as I can for the next effort. All right, let's take a quick look at what the long run, the weekly long run should look like. So 1 to 2 hours is a good spot to work up to. I've experimented with this a little bit over the past, and I've generally found that going much longer than that just doesn't have much benefits. The last time I did a Hyrox, I built up to 25K long runs, so it would be right around 2.5 hours for me. And I just didn't find that was doing much other than just making me more tired after that run. And if I did go to the gym after to maybe do a little bit of strength training, I just didn't have much left in the tank to do that. So typically when you're doing the long run, you want to just stick with, again, the zone 2 pace that we mentioned earlier. And again, you can progress this over time. So when I first started incorporating the long runs, my base zone 2 runs were around 9 kilometers. And so what I did is the first week I went out and I think I did 11K. And then from there, the next week I did 12, and the week after 13, 14, 15. Just kept adding a kilometer a week. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to add on, let's say you're doing 10K base runs right now. You don't need to make it a 15K if you've never done that. Progress it slowly and make the progress over time. And that's how you get those consistent results without getting injured, which is absolutely a critical component. As far as these long runs go, you'll want to be considering hydration at a minimum. So probably drinking a little bit of water throughout. And depending on the length of the run, how well fueled you are before, you'll also want to be considering electrolytes and carbs. So you can experiment with this, see what works, but fueling maybe halfway through with some carbs can be a good idea, especially if you're doing something closer to 2 hours. And as far as the electrolytes go, it doesn't even need to be anything fancy, like a fancy powder or anything like that. Doing just a little bit of salt in your water, maybe with something sweet. You can even add, you can do a little mixture of honey and salt in your water, and that'll get you covered on both the electrolytes and the carbs. If you're someone who sweats a lot, and especially if you have salty sweat, which you should be able to get a general idea. If you're sweating a lot and you have a little taste of your sweat and it tastes really salty, if that's your sort of profile, you'll want to be considering getting some electrolytes in and keep your body performing well. Okay, one final little component that I like to add in that is pretty niche to Hyrox is that you want to be doing some sort of compromised running. So when we're running in Hyrox, with the exception of the very first run, we are going to be running on tired legs after completing a station. Some stations, it's going to be you're going to come out feeling much more tax, and that feeling of those first couple 100 meters when your legs are really heavy, you want to know, at a minimum, know what it feels like. And not only know what it feels like, but you want to be capable of running efficiently and at a strong pace when your legs are tired. So typically the best way to train for this is just doing some kind of circuits in the gym where you're alternating between some sort of station work and runs. It definitely does not need to be a race simulation, but you should, you could do heavy sleds, for example, is probably that's a great one that your legs are going to be feeling pretty tired after that. Doesn't need to be the full 50 meters. You could do, half of that. Your legs are probably going to still be feeling pretty shot after that. So you can do that. Go into a run. Again, doesn't need to be the full kilometer. I would even argue that the first 250 to 400 meters, to 500 meters of that kilometer is probably the most important part. By the time you're getting past that, your legs are ideally starting to recover a little bit from the beating they took on the sleds or similar stations. I would say that lunges and burpees probably pretty good stations where your legs will be feeling pretty tough after doing that. And this is just the importance of this is it's going to help you feel ready for race conditions if you're training for a Hyrox. Okay, to take a bit of a larger picture view, I want to talk about how you can progress all of this over time. And this is one of the really cool things about Hyrox and running is that there is a lot of ways to go about this. So just to cover a few here, number one, the number of runs that you're doing per week is a great spot. So if you want to add in an extra run, let's say maybe you're doing 3 a week right now, maybe you add in a fourth, keep it short, and then that goes into the next point here, which is you can obviously increase the length of the runs. So I typically like to go between the number of runs and the length of the runs. I find 10% per week increase is a pretty good rule to follow. And this applies in multiple ways. So, first of all, your total volume, total number of kilometers per week, you generally don't want to exceed more than a 10% increase. I have done this in the past, much more than 10%, even just 20. And it just, for me, it leads to injuries, and it tends to be the same thing for a lot of people. And it might be fine for the first week, and maybe the second week, maybe in the third, but then as the fatigue just starts building up and your body isn't fully capable of dealing with that new load, little injuries will start to pop up. So that's definitely something to be aware of. As far as other ways to progress goes, obviously the pace. Generally, on zone 2 and your long run, I would just keep it, based on heart rate and feel. You shouldn't necessarily be trying to hit specific paces on your zone 2 runs. They will naturally your pace will naturally increase over time though, as you train and your body adapts and you get more efficient in zone 2. Where you can increase the paces the most, I find, is during your quality runs. So you can do this, as I mentioned earlier, you can increase your interval pace. If you're doing a tempo run, you can increase tempo pace. If you are doing VO2 max work, again, you can shoot for faster time on each kilometer, 800-meter repeat, whatever you're doing there. As mentioned earlier, another great way to increase and progress over time is going to be your interval length. So I say interval here, but this applies to all of your quality runs. So if you're doing a tempo run, like I said, when I did that, I was adding 500 meters just about every week. And then again, as mentioned earlier, you can manipulate your rest times. So you can make them shorter. There's some cases where it'll make sense to make them longer. So you could even, instead of going from 1.2 to 1.4 to 1.6 and so on kilometers for each interval, Uh, you could go from 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers, but do less intervals, but a slightly longer uh, rest time. So instead of 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. When I was training for a marathon, this was one of the changes I made. I went to longer intervals on my interval runs. Now, these are some of the main ways to produce progress over time. I want to be very clear about one thing though. Do not try and progress every single one of these options at the same time. You can do more than one at a time, but if you try and make all of them better at the same time on every run, it's just not going to work out. You're going to push your body too far and you're probably going to get hurt. On a final note about the 10% per week rule, um, be reasonable about this. This is a guideline. So if you're just like brand new to running, and let's say you went out for a 2K run and that was your first run, you're probably safe to do a little more than a 10% increase. Like you can go to more than 2.2 kilometers. At the same time, let's say you're already training with incredibly high volume. For example, let's say maybe a Hyrox Elite 15 athlete is at 80 kilometers a week, something like that. For them to increase by 10% per week it's a pretty solid, very large increase. I mean, you're talking 8 kilometers every week. If you do that for 3 weeks, suddenly your weekly volume has gone from 80 kilometers a week to 104 kilometers in just 3 weeks. With all that being said, I wish you all the best in building your Hyrox running program. Let me know how this works for you. And if you do want some help with your Hyrox training, you're new to the sport, aren't sure where to start, I've got an app built for Hyrox athletes that'll put together a training program for you to get you dialed in on your running and your Hyrox training in general. So link for that is in the description. Check it out.